Okay, I think we'll go ahead and start. My name is Mark Leggott. I'm the Executive Director at Research Data Canada. And this is the latest in our relaunched webinar series, which started last month. This one is a general session on RDC. What is RDC and what are the types of things that we're doing? Before we get into the webinar itself, just a few housekeeping bits. The webinar is being recorded. The recording consists of my voice and the screen, in this case the website and soon the slide deck. That recording will be made publicly available on the RDC website, including a downloadable version of the slide deck, which will also be available in French. This webinar will only be conducted in English. I would also indicate that if you do have questions, please at any point during the webinar use either the chat window or the Q&A window. I have both open here, so I'll be able to see any questions that are put in. None of the viewer audio tracks are enabled, so the only way to ask questions is to put them into either the chat or the Q&A. The chat and the Q&A questions or associated names will not be part of the recording, and I will not mention questioners' names. So please feel free to ask questions. You will not be personally identified, and it will not appear in the webinar recording. So I think what I'll do is start just quickly letting people know that we are moving ahead with additional webinars over the coming months. We have tentative webinars booked until July. The upcoming webinars, including an update on the Carl Portage Network next month in February. And we also have a session on research data management guidelines and policies, which will be a joint presentation with myself and Jessica Mankowski from CIHR. And we also have upcoming sessions on clinical trials, DataCite, and ResearchLink, just to mention a few. So lots of upcoming sessions. And as always, if there are particular topics that you feel would be particularly useful for the stakeholder community, then please let me know. I'd be happy to facilitate additional webinars in the RDC series. So please feel free to let me know if you do have topics of interest. And the general context, of course, is research data management. And today's webinar is intended to give listeners an idea of the role of Research Data Canada and what we do in terms of the Canadian ecosystem, and some of the committees and activities that we're undertaking. And with apologies to some of those on the webinar today that may have attended a session that I've given in the last few months, there is some overlap, including the context that I'm about to discuss. But I feel it's an important underlying foundation about RDC and what drives RDC and defines the opportunities that we deal with. So normally in an interactive session, I would ask people in attendance what this is, but since that's not, I suppose I could ask you to type it into chat, but I won't do that. This is a graphical representation of the Zika virus, which is an important public health issue. As many of you know, over the last 2 years, it's emerged as a critical health issue across the globe. And as a result of that, as one example, in February of last year, a number of organizations from across the research ecosystem, including commercial, higher education, and funding agencies, all announced that they would publicly share their data and results as quickly as possible to try and deal with and find appropriate approaches and treatments to Zika. That this particular article, which occurred in the journal Stat, was quickly followed by another one, which represented the concerns of an individual researcher who wrote a letter in Nature that highlighting that a recent data set, in essence, in this case, the sequenced genome of the Anopheles mosquito, that this researcher made available was used by another researcher, and that particular data set was not cited properly. So the researcher who produced that gene sequence data was not properly cited and credited. So this I call a gentle tension that exists in our ecosystem, the desire to have publicly funded research made publicly accessible, and the challenge in a personal context of researchers needing to receive appropriate credit in their own particular context, whether that be for things like promotion and tenure or innovative opportunities they have in terms of spin-offs and all of the kinds of things that I suspect many of us are well aware of. The other way that is, I think, very strongly illustrated is with the Cancer Moonshot program, which of course was the Obama administration's, or is the Obama administration's response to the increasing tendency for presidents to define big problems that they provide resources and funding for. And in this particular case, of course, it was the trying to find a cure for cancer. And as Vice President Biden, as he was asked to move this initiative forward, he was somewhat surprised to find that one of the biggest stumbling blocks or issues in cancer research was in fact the lack of data sharing. So based on his blue ribbon panel and conversations that was had, and to some degree, I suppose, an element of frustration in dealing with publicly funded researchers who would not make their data accessible, he decided to pull funding from what he termed the outliers that decided not to share their data. So clearly, there's a great deal of interest across the research community and ecosystem in the opportunity to share data. The other thing that I like to do in describing this context is to relate the data and the interest in openly accessible data to biodiversity. And biodiversity is that diversity of plant and animal life that's represented by species that are still with us. And a lot of people engaged in the biodiversity community highlight the importance to preserve species that are at risk, because somewhere in that biodiversity, as many of us know, are cures or potential cures for all kinds of diseases that strike humans and are an issue. So for me, as having a background in biology, I use the term dataversity to describe that diversity of data and information that is typically represented by openly accessible data. And just as with our biodiversity, I think it's increasingly important to preserve that data that's at risk, whether it's because it's not properly preserved or it's not in an appropriate format, or all of the things, again, that many of us are aware of, because somewhere in that dataversity is potentially information that could lead to important discoveries and innovation. So again, I think that's very familiar to us. It's not necessarily always immediately familiar to all of us why researchers, and again, in this context, I speak of publicly funded researchers, do not share their data. This is a list from a recent journal article that talked about the culture of data sharing, particularly in STEM, and why researchers don't share their research data. And these are phrases that I took directly from the journal article, so they're not my own. but you can see from this list that it's somewhat variable. But certainly one of the concerns is that the results of research data could potentially be used in a positive way by the researcher or their research team and institution, whether that be in the form of, as I mentioned, promotion and tenure type credit, or economic spin-off opportunities that may come from things like patents and the like. But there is also a lot of concern about things like confidentiality, privacy of data, especially obviously where it involves human trials. Concern that lack of understanding of the data will result in some lack of understanding if the data is reused. Technical challenges to sharing the data or getting it in a shape where it can be shared. So these are all important reasons that have been used to indicate why data can't be shared. It's very useful to take a look at the article because it does respond to each of the reasons given. Sorry, somebody's just indicating that the sound is not great. Not quite sure why that might be, but if anybody else is having sound issues or problems, maybe just indicate in the chat, and I'll see if there's anything I can do if it's more than one viewer. So again, lots of reasons why, but again, highly recommended article because I think it indicates why those reasons are typically not valid reasons for sharing the data. The other phrase I like to use, this is a particular favorite of mine. I believe it comes from a Chinese proverb. A closed book is but a block of wood, which of course refers to the fact that many of us in the library community are very familiar with, and that is if a book isn't used, then clearly it's the information that's in that book is not accessible to people. And I like to use the term an inaccessible data set is but a flash of electricity as a complement to that print analogy. Whether it is to the individual researcher or the research team or institution or the broader research community, when data sets are not properly preserved and maintained and put in a form that makes them accessible, then the potential loss is substantial and no different than a book that's never opened. And this is also a very, very important point because I think what is often kind of put to the side or not discussed in these conversations is the simple fact that by preparing data for more or for broader access, one also generally prepares that data for longer-term use and preservation. In my prior life, I was a university librarian at a couple of institutions. And a not infrequent visit from faculty to my office was to explain that they had lost data because it was data that was in an old file format and they could no longer open that file. So when I talk about reusability of data, I often, and making data openly accessible, it doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be publicly shared, but the process that one goes through to prepare data for broader use is a very important step in just ensuring that that data is useful to the researcher that created it down the road. So that's a very important point that I think we need to remember. So with that context of publicly accessible data, well-managed data, accessible data, all of those different terms that one might encounter, for me, that comes down to a simple charge which can be reflected in this question, and that is what would happen to discovery and innovation, whether it's in the context of a public health emergency like Zika or Ebola, or some social science policy perspective, or anything that is informed or supported by research, what would happen to our ability to innovate in those contexts if all research outputs were publicly accessible tomorrow? And I think that's an important question to pose to researchers. Many of the people on today's webinar are in the university context, not all. But I would certainly highlight the McGill Neurological Institute or Montreal Neurological Institute as a best practice example in our Canadian context, and one that last year did announce a substantial effort at making all of the results for the next 5 years of their research publicly accessible as open data. And there was an announcement late in 2016 highlighting a private donation that was made to the Montreal Neurological Institute specifically because of that commitment that they had made to making data openly accessible. So again, a gentle tension that exists typically between those doing the research and those wishing to take advantage of the research. But I think we in Canada have international leaders in the Montreal Neurological Institute and others like Ocean Networks Canada as good examples of what can be done. And I think Guy Rouleau, the director of the MNI, I think summed it up quite nicely by basically indicating that the reason why he feels this is important as a top-notch researcher is that people will look at the results of their research in other ways. And it's that different way of looking at things, that different questions that people would have, the different intersections and relationships that are made with particular data sets and others that the original researcher may not have thought of, that are critical in this open data or reusable data context. So I do tend to, again, I've used a number of words to describe this concept of making data more openly accessible. I tend to use the term reusability because I think it's not quite as, using the term open data, I think, particularly in some contexts or communities, can be a little bit, not so much controversial, but it creates a concern right off the bat. Whereas I think the term reusability is a friendlier term, but also one that has a great deal of benefit no matter the point of view. It also doesn't assume that the data, the research data outputs that have been created, need to be made openly accessible without any kind of access controls. And clearly in a number of contexts, sometimes limited access is the only way to make data accessible. Where personal information is involved is clearly a common example of that. So this is just one set of examples of how reusability surfaces in the research context. We typically think of the top one of reusing data as additional or data input into a new experiment or round of research, but it can also be used to enhance existing data, validate data, test the reproducibility of research, improve the discoverability of important data that might otherwise not be known about. Serendipity is a concept that many of us, again, in the library community are very familiar with, and why we have open shelves that we allow people to go and browse and try and discover new material because it's next to the book that I was looking for. The same concept, I think, is a very important one when it comes to digital data. And once data is available and well described, you can make links between different types of data that inform each other. So lots of reasons why reusability is important. So that's the term that I tend to prefer to use these days, and to some degree, it's equivalent to some of the other familiar terms that we see, like open data, publicly accessible data, and the like. So that's the context that I like to provide. Now, to give a sense of Research Data Canada's role, a little bit of history. Research Data Canada has been around since 2011. The initial effort to create RDC came out of a data summit that happened in September of 2011. And as a result of that, a secretariat was set up. Pam Bjornson, at the time the head librarian at CISTI, became the chair, and a number of people, primarily from the university and federal government communities, were invited. And NRC provided that all-important secretariat support for the first 5 years of RDC's existence. And of course, the leadership that came from NRC's CISTI and subsequently the NRC Knowledge Management Branch's role that they play in Canada when it came to, in particular, scientific research. So that steering committee met for a number of years, and then in 2015, that steering committee highlighted the challenge that RDC had with everybody kind of working off the side of their desk in a volunteer fashion, and the desire to move forward with very specific projects. So with that in mind, they decided that a funded approach would be critical to RDC continuing its good work. So with that in mind, they approached Canary. Canary is the federally funded organization that does a number of things, including working with our regional networks to run the higher education backbone, CANet 4. Canary also funds research software, manages the Canadian Access Federation and the associated services that come from that kind of shibboleth login, and a number of other things, and now as well supporting Research Data Canada. So Walter Stewart, who some of you will know, provided a kind of a director role working with Pam and the steering committee for close to a year while the process of firming up the funding for RDC and hiring a director took place, and then I started in February of last year. So coming up to my first year anniversary soon. So Research Data Canada is first and foremost an organization that facilitates the conversation around best practices with research data management in Canada. So with that in mind, Research Data Canada's vision is that Canadians will have access to national and international collections of publicly funded research data. And I think it's important to highlight that international piece, but also the Canadians part. So RDC's primary interest is making sure that the results of our publicly funded research, but also the intersections with the international community of research is accessible to Canadians in whatever context is important to them, whether it's to avail themselves of information for their own context or community work that's being done, university research, commercial research, NGO, all of those potential opportunities are important. And then we don't just focus on the use of research data in a common context such as a university research. So our mission with that vision is to work with stakeholders to ensure that research data is reusable in support of that innovation that benefits all Canadians. And again, here I would highlight the reusable terminology, which we've touched on, but also this stakeholders concept, which I'll highlight in more detail shortly. So with that vision and mission, RDC has a multi-pronged strategy, and of course, like any organization that has a broad stakeholder community, that strategy is dynamic and changes with time. Right now, for 2017, I would summarize our strategy as in this slide by saying that our primary interest is facilitating the development of a collection of integrated national data services that support researchers through all stages of the research lifecycle and promote compliance. Now here, when it says researchers, probably more properly, that should say in support of stakeholders. regardless of their role in the research lifecycle, because the work that RDC facilitates and the conversations that we encourage involve our funding agencies like the tri-agencies, as well as researchers and other types of organizations. We're increasingly focusing our language and activities around this concept of national data services. And I'll talk a little bit more about that shortly. But for all intents and purposes, that is a way to describe a set of services, computer, machine, automated services, any type of service that is deliberately created and provided and maintained to surface at a national level. So, for example, a data repository that may typically work at an institutional context, RDC would be interested in facilitating that kind of activity for a repository that acts at a national level. So national data services, again, are very broad, and to some degree, our focus in the coming months is to define what we mean by that phrase, national data services. So in doing that, in facilitating that, our focus is on enabling activities. So most importantly, RDC is not an operational organization. We work very closely with organizations like Portage and Compute Canada and Canary itself, who do provide operational support for research and research data management. So our goal is to enable those activities. So when it comes to an organization like the Carl Portage Network, Research Data Canada's interest is in promoting the Carl Portage Network as a best practice support service and set of data management services that are accessible to researchers. We also try whenever we can to highlight best practice. And one of the ways that we determine that best practice is by liaising with international research data management agencies and projects. So that's a very important part. For example, I'm on a member of the RDA, Research Data Alliance, a National Data Services Interest Group. And one of the projects I was actually just working on yesterday was summarizing country reports that were created late last year, describing approaches at in half a dozen countries to providing national data services. So I'm in the process of drafting a document with some colleagues from the UK that summarizes these country reports, and with the intent of trying to create a description of what one might consider best practices in the provision of national data services. So maybe to put that in a little bit more context, in the center of this slide is the probably very familiar research data lifecycle. This one comes from JISC and the DCC. And on the outside, you have that the kind of high-level activities that happen in the outer wheel, and then within that wheel, specific activities within the research data lifecycle, like the plan and design of research. So Research Data Canada is interested in all phases of that research data lifecycle. And we're interested in the role that all of the organizations around that wheel may play in that research data lifecycle. So we're interested in facilitating the conversation with our federal and provincial funding agencies, nonprofit and NGO research organizations that are interested in use research data for purposes of policy development, for example. Our typical university, college, research organizations. Of course, I would apologize that universities box should say universities and colleges, or simply higher education, and also commercial research organizations. So we do not restrict ourselves to the interests of a stakeholder community that excludes commercial interests, whether it be a commercial organization that provides digital research infrastructure or a commercial organization that uses data in their research. And the other one that's important there is the open data community. So that's another important part of RDC stakeholder community that represents an important source of primary data that would be of interest to a lot of researchers. So that's our stakeholder community, and it's within that context that my role is facilitating the conversation nationally within that stakeholder community around the interests throughout that research data lifecycle. This is a somewhat, to some degree, confusing slide, because unless you know what all those acronyms are, it's not clear what this means. But this is my way of highlighting two important concepts. And one, looking at research information in the bottom left and research data in the top, and open data bottom right and open information upper left, is that things like metadata, so administrative metadata that might be collected by a research office, or the actual data that's produced, or the journal articles, that whole continuum of outputs is all of interest to Research Data Canada, in that if one effectively harvests, uses, aggregates, makes accessible all of that metadata and data, then the things that we can do with that research in that research ecosystem are much greater than we can if we think about these things in separate boxes or silos. The various organizations represented with the acronyms, whether it's Canary or Compute Canada, which are service providers, or Carl and the Portage Project, which also provides services at a higher level in the stack, or something like Ocean Networks Canada, which is an actual research organization that does, in many respects, emulate best practices in the management of very complex science data. And that the diagram in the middle is meant to highlight that a common question I get is, what's the difference between RDC and Portage? And it's an easy question to answer, and I think to a large degree I have, by highlighting that RDC's role is one of facilitation and Portage's role is one of service delivery. So there's very little overlap in that, but there is a substantial amount of overlap in the interests that we share. So we're both interested in best practice metadata, schemas and approaches that can be used to describe the complete, rich set of outputs that are involved in that research data lifecycle. We also have an overlap in a common interest with CASRE, which is interested in the standards and terminologies and that are used to describe the information that's used in the research data lifecycle. So RDC is also interested in those because of the way that they can inform a best practice discovery system, for example, or how they can make it easier to access and retrieve data, whether it's a funding application, a research data management plan, a journal article, or a data set. So RDC is interested in facilitating that conversation, working together with our collaborators with a central common interest in how to support research and ultimately lead to greater reuse. Excuse me. So one of the ways that RDC moves forward and determines its priorities is through a steering committee. Right now, that steering committee is chaired by David Castle, who's the Vice President of Research at the University of Victoria. David joined RDC as the second chair of the steering committee in May of this year, or sorry, of 2016. So he replaced Pam Bjornson, who was the first steering committee chair. The membership comes from the broad stakeholder community that I highlighted in the previous slide. So it includes funders, members of the higher education community, nonprofits, commercial entities, all of the organizations that are represented in that stakeholder community. That steering committee meets quarterly, and in the first face-to-face meeting of that group, which happened at the end of November just last year, I presented a vision document, 2 pages and a diagram that described at a very high level the concept of national data services and the kind of key components of a national data service framework. So the steering committee, that vision document will be released publicly in the coming months. I'm just putting a couple of final edits on the document, and that with the steering committee's endorsement, that document will form the basis of a conversation over the next 12 months that will help to define and refine and describe Canada's opportunity to create national data services. The other all-important way that RDC carries out its business is through its standing committees and working groups. So I'll spend a little bit of time on this in the next slide, excuse me, to highlight some of the very specific activities that those committees and working groups are working with. So like the steering committee, the standing committees, of which there are 4, meet quarterly. There is the explicit goal and intention of not overtaxing members of the committees and working groups. So the way we do that with the committees is to only ask them to commit to quarterly meetings and the occasional communications between meetings. And those committees are asked to oversee and review the outputs of working groups. Working groups are our way of not overtaxing. Working groups is to try and provide a focused activity, and one that has typically some kind of time limitation, which could be a couple of months to a couple of years. So a couple of examples. The BP in these slides means best practices. So it typically is called a best practices working group because the intent is to produce a document as an output, as a final or interim output. So the most recent working group was the Persistent IDs group, which released a document highlighting best practices with persistent IDs, both are for scholars, institutions, data, equipment, and briefly mentioned a few of the other contexts where IDs are important. And that document includes a set of recommendations that ask particular stakeholder groups to consider things like adopting or requiring ORCID as a best practice, for example, when it comes to scholar IDs. The working group in this particular case will also is just getting started. The initial document was written by a few members from the stakeholder community with some excellent help from Kathleen Shearer and Chantal Ridsdale, who was the first RDC intern. So the working group will steward that document forward and follow up on best practice as well as the recommendations. Data deposit guidelines is a working group that will do a similar thing with a document that was produced by RDC a couple of years ago. The Scholar Metadata Group will hopefully work closely with the Carl Portage metadata group that's looking at best practices with respect to metadata in the broader ecosystem context. So the interest there is how do we best reflect metadata across the research data lifecycle, representing not just the scholar, but also the scholar's outputs, and how do we do so in such a way that it can surface in a national discovery system. The Iridium Research Data Management Glossary is one that is done in collaboration with CASRE and is under active development by considering new definitions for what started as the Research Data Canada Research Data Management Glossary and has now been moved into an international context in a collaboration with CASRE and CODATA and other national groups. So that group, as you can imagine, Standards and Interoperability, focuses on standards and best practices and how those would ensure a robust national data service. and interoperability with international efforts. So that represents the priority for that committee in the coming months. The infrastructure committee is just getting started. All of the committees and working groups for Research Data Canada were completely revamped in the last few months. Partly part of the reason why there hasn't been a lot from the committees and working groups because of the need to retool and refocus. So a number of the infrastructure committee working groups, as you can see, will be focused on this question of national data services. We're looking at a survey and also developing requirements for a national data service. One of the important events coming in September related to that national data services conversation is an all-day summit, which will take place just before or just after the RDA plenary, which is in Montreal in September. So that's infrastructure, and then we also have a policy committee, which will be looking at data governance models, as well as research data management guidelines, and the development of policies that would assist institutions in implementing data, not just data governance policies, but also research data management and open data policies. Just to return back to the previous one, and one of the questions is, when will the IDs document be available? The IDs document was made available last month when it was introduced in an RDC webinar. So the easiest way to access it, if you go to the RDC webpage and click on the activities menu, choose the webinars link, the top button on that page is to archive webinars, and the downloadable document is available there. I'm just about to upload a new version of the IDs document, which includes additional authorship, but also has that all-important DOI number that because RDC's commitment is to itself use the best practices that it promotes in its conversations and outputs. So I'm just preparing a new version of the IDs document that will have a DOI so that RDC can walk the walk and use what we promote. But if certainly the document itself will not change, it's simply the addition of a DOI and a change in the additional authorship references. So you can access it on the site now. The Communications, Outreach, and Education Committee will have a focus on a number of things, including this webinar series. RDC tries every month to have at least one blog post which highlights organizations, typically in our Canadian community, that are doing best practice. Previous blogs included one that highlighted the Montreal Neurological Institute, Policy-Wise in Alberta, which is a very interesting organization, not only making research available, but using best practices in that context. And the new one we're working on will highlight Ocean Networks Canada and its efforts at best practice research data management. That one of the other working groups in that Communications, Outreach, and Education Committee will also plan that National Data Summit in September. So if you are interested in any of these activities, sorry, I meant to highlight the research link. Ecosystem map, this is in fact this working group is underway and working with RDC on what has currently is represented by a proof of concept Vivo implementation. Vivo is a semantic repository for information about, in the case of ResearchLink, organizations and services and people who provide services and support for research data management. So we're looking at ResearchLink as a publicly accessible resource that will help people find the types of services that they're interested in their own research activities. And so that National Data Summit is a good example of the education and outreach part of RDC. Finally, just in terms of participation, all of those standing committees, the four standing committees and the steering committee have links on the RDC website. And that includes a link to the terms of reference, a list of the members, and also a list of vacancies in terms of the types of organizations that we've highlighted. If you do want to get involved, either at a committee level or a working group, right now this slide deck and those pages on the RDC website are the best way to get a sense of what's happening. In the near future, we'll be providing a much more detailed listing of participants on the working groups and the types of things they're doing. The next 2 to 3 months is the time at which all of the committees and working groups will be activated, and for those that aren't already active, and move forward with specific goals and activities. So if you do look at that website and you go, well, the only organizations that have a vacancy are X and Y, don't pay any attention to that. Let me know anyway, because I have that all-important member at large category, where I'm happy to slot people in that are interested in any of those committee activities or working groups. So please let me know if you would like to participate. Again, my interest and the interest of our steering committee is not to overwhelm people and the same people, but to get as many people as we can involved from a broad stakeholder community, and not just people that have a depth of knowledge or a long-standing knowledge in a particular area, but also people who maybe because they've taken on a new portfolio as a research data management librarian or IT support person, and they have an interest in understanding more and getting involved in activities that will build their knowledge. That's a very, very critical aspect of Research Data Canada's mode of work, is to build capacity. So if you're interested but feel that you don't have a depth of knowledge reflecting the focus of those steering committees or working groups, then please ignore that and let me know, because you're probably in many respects more important than those that do have that depth of knowledge. We're also always interested in communicating with people, so if you want to be on our list, we have both an official newsletter list as well as my own mailing distribution list where I let people know. And for example, I'll be sending out my last 2 updates, which highlight the things that I've been up to as the executive director and the things that our stakeholder community and committees are producing. So I'll be sending out the last 2 updates to that network of newsletter subscribers, but also my personal list of contacts. So please let me know if you'd like to be kept up to date. And participate in any of our hosted activities. Those will be defined as we move forward. So that ends the prepared comments that I had. I noticed an update in the chat for those people that have the chat window open, highlighting the PolicyWise group, which is probably not as well known as many of our universities, but as I highlighted, a very creative and passionate organization when it comes to research data management. So any other questions or comments, please feel free to put them into the Q&A box or the chat box. And I will highlight that if you simply type in the normal chat box, your chat comments or questions would be available to everyone if I send it to everyone. So I'm going to go ahead and send that most recent one on PolicyWise, because that's only sent to panelists. Yep, there we go. any other, I'll just give people a few minutes to indicate any additional comments or questions. And what I'll do is, based on the question that was asked, I've just switched to the website. And I'm on the webinars page, which is accessible from the activities menu. And then under archived webinars, you can see a link to the unique identifiers document, as well as the video and PowerPoint deck that introduced the document. So as I mentioned, that document will change shortly, but again, it's only the additional citation data that will be added to that. And it's, again, useful to take a look at the site. We've got a number of things planned, including a highlight of that research link database that I mentioned earlier. A conversation about discovery systems for research, more detail on that Iridium research data management glossary, different training approaches and outreach approaches to data management, the issue of publishing negative results, an update on our outputs, and the evolution of data management plans, especially around the topic of active data management plans, replication and reproducibility, and an update on the Portage Compute Canada FRDR project. So that brings us into July. And as I mentioned, under our work, you can access the list of terms of reference for the committees, as well as the various roles and responsibilities, and the current membership. So a number of those have yet to be used. The other thing I would highlight here, throughout our site, we're trying to put images that we get from our stakeholder community. So this particular image, for example, was provided to us by Simon Fraser. And we're in the process of linking the images themselves, but whenever you see an image, there should be an image source link where we try to link to the research data management pages for that organization that provided the image. So it is, I think, a good way for us to help promote the work of our stakeholder community and to reflect the research that happens in Canada by using images from that stakeholder community. So you can see another one here. For example, from UPEI, with a link to their data services. So I don't see any questions or comments in the chat or the QA. So if there are none, then I will thank everybody for attending. I hope that you can listen in on future webinars as well. And as I mentioned, the audio and video of the slide deck and the downloadable slide deck will be made available in the coming week. And anybody who's registered for the webinar will receive a message highlighting that material is available. I see one viewer has indicated that it was covered, and now they just need to make decisions about how we can help, and I would agree with that. There's lots of opportunity and lots of interesting stuff coming, so please do let me know, and I'd be happy to get you engaged given your interests. So thanks all for attending, and you'll hear more from me and our stakeholder community in future. Thank you very much.